The city of Sacramento moved at its usual rhythm that evening. Commuters filling the streets, neon signs blinking to life, and the golden sun slowly sinking behind rows of palm trees and glass buildings. The rush of traffic carried a familiar hum, but within that ordinary rhythm, the smallest spark was about to ignite a confrontation that neither man involved would ever forget. Eric Porter adjusted his tie as his sedan glided through the boulevard, the faint drone of the evening news filtering through his radio. He wasn't listening closely. His mind wandered between a presentation he'd delivered earlier at the office and the thought of finally sitting down to a quiet dinner. He had been in Sacramento for only a few months, but he was already settling into its steady, fast-paced beat. The people here carried themselves differently than in his last city, but the unspoken rules of urban life were the same. Keep moving, stay focused, and avoid trouble. Trouble, however, has a way of finding those who aren't looking for it. As the light ahead shifted from green to yellow, Eric eased his foot onto the brake. His sedan slowed gracefully, coasting to a halt just as the light turned red. For a fleeting second, he let himself relax. He exhaled, adjusted the air conditioning, and let his thoughts drift. Then, sudden, sharp, undeniable, the piercing wail of a siren shattered the calm. Blue and red lights flared in his rearview mirror. Eric's brow furrowed, confusion tugging at him. He glanced at the dashboard instinctively. No speeding, no warning lights, no reckless maneuvering. Everything had been careful, controlled, precise, as always. Still, he pulled calmly toward the curb, rolling down his window as the patrol car eased to a stop behind him. The cruiser's engine cut, but the rotating lights kept painting the street in staccato bursts of crimson and sapphire. From the driver's side stepped a figure who looked like he had been pulled straight from the blueprint of authority. Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with a military buzz cut, moved toward the sedan with calculated swagger. His badge glinted in the fading sunlight. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes carried the sharp, scrutinizing gleam of a man already forming judgments. "License and registration," Larson said curtly, his tone clipped, not unfriendly but devoid of warmth. Eric complied without hesitation. He moved deliberately, opening the glove compartment slowly before handing over the requested documents. His demeanor remained calm. Steady hands, steady breathing, measured movements. He knew enough to not give an officer any reason to feel provoked. But even in that careful precision, he could feel Larson's gaze pressing into him, as though the officer were searching for something, anything to validate suspicion. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning slightly toward the window. Eric met his eyes, polite but firm. "I'm not entirely sure, officer." Larson's lip twitched almost imperceptibly. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light." His words sounded practiced, but his voice carried a flicker of hesitation, like he was reaching for justification rather than stating fact. "I see. I thought I slowed in time, but I understand." It could have ended there, an exchange of words, perhaps a warning, maybe even a citation. But something in the air shifted, delicate and invisible, like the tightening of a bowstring. Larson didn't move away. He didn't reach for his citation pad. Instead, he lingered, eyes narrowing as he studied Eric. It was no longer about the traffic light. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked suddenly, glancing down at the license before looking back at Eric. Eric allowed the faintest pause before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. The address is correct on the license." But Larson wasn't truly listening. His questions weren't about details. They were about probing, about control, about searching for a narrative that hadn't yet materialized. His posture stiffened as his shoulders squared as if he'd silently promoted this stop from routine to consequential. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" he pressed. "Home," Eric said evenly, keeping his voice neutral. The silence between them stretched, heavy and deliberate. Larson's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Eric felt the unmistakable ripple of tension. This wasn't about traffic anymore. This was about perception. Larson's perception of who belonged here, who carried suspicion simply by existing in front of him. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered, voice calm but carrying the weight of command. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened for just a moment, a reflexive response that betrayed nothing outwardly. His expression remained composed. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Larson's lip curled in something between a smirk and the scowl. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The words hung in the air like static, an unspoken threat dressed as instruction. Eric inhaled slowly, then opened the door. As he stepped out, the evening breeze carried the scent of asphalt and exhaust. He was taller than Larson, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the officer's uniform. His posture remained respectful, but his very presence unsettled Larson. Polished shoes, pressed jacket, calm authority radiating without a badge. "Hands where I can see them," Larson said, gesturing toward the hood. Eric complied with deliberate slowness, placing his hands flat against the warm metal. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" "Just routine," Larson muttered, though the faint smirk returned. "We've had incidents around here. Can't never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. His words were sharp, though his tone remained even. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a strike. Larson flinched, barely, but enough. His hand drifted toward his belt in reflex, the way a man steadies himself when he feels cornered. "Watch your tone," he said, voice firm, edges hardening. "I'm simply asking," Eric replied. No defiance, no aggression, only a quiet firmness that seemed to unsettle Larson more than outright resistance. Larson stopped pacing. His gaze hardened, his tone sharpened, and with clipped precision, he gave the order meant to seal dominance. "Turn around. Hands on the hood. I'm going to check for weapons." Eric raised his eyebrow, the faintest trace of incredulity touching his voice. "Weapons? Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" "Don't make me repeat myself," he snapped. Eric studied him for a long moment, then complied. Palms pressed against the warm hood, his body language was calm, steady, deliberate. Larson approached, his boots crunching against asphalt, and began the search. It was quick, rough, lingering longer than necessary in places. It wasn't just a pat-down, it was an attempt to provoke, to dominate, to force a crack in the facade of composure. "You're clean," Larson muttered reluctantly, frustration seeping through. He hadn't found anything. No justification, no weapon, no excuse to escalate. Eric turned slowly, his eyes sharp but his voice calm. "Of course I am." And for the first time, Larson felt something he hadn't expected to feel. The unease of facing someone who couldn't be bent by pressure, someone who wouldn't play the part he'd written for them. The following weeks unfolded like an unrelenting storm, not of weather, but of conversations, paperwork, confrontations, and revelations. Eric Porter, no longer just the man pulled over on the side of the road, became the central figure of a growing movement within the Sacramento Police Department. His role as head of internal affairs was never easy, but after that night with Officer Bradley Larson, it carried a weight unlike anything he'd felt before. Each morning when the sunlight streamed through the blinds of his office, it reminded him that change, true, systemic, uncomfortable change, was never convenient. It demanded sacrifice, resilience, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Eric's days began earlier and ended later. He dove into Larson's file with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting every complaint, every overlooked detail, and every quietly handled case. What troubled him most was not the severity of the complaints, though some were alarming, but the consistency with which they had been brushed aside. It was as if the department had decided that small ripples of misconduct didn't matter until they became tidal waves. And yet, Eric knew better. He knew that culture wasn't built in grand scandals. It was built in the everyday actions of men and women in uniform. Larson was a symptom, not the disease. And if the disease was complacency, Eric's mission was to become the cure. He called for a series of internal reviews, pulling records not just on Larson, but on dozens of officers across the city. What he found was sobering: patterns of behavior that mirrored Larson's in subtle but undeniable ways, traffic stops that escalated without cause, reports of suspicious behavior that seemed to target the same demographics repeatedly, complaints that were closed with the word unfounded stamped in red ink, though the details suggested otherwise. It wasn't about vilifying every officer. Eric knew there were countless men and women in the force who risked their lives daily with honor, courage, and fairness. He had worked alongside them, respected them, and trusted them. But he also knew that good intentions were meaningless if silence allowed misconduct to thrive. Silence, he thought often, was the loudest accomplice of injustice. Meetings with Chief Daniels grew frequent, often stretching late into the evening. The chief was a seasoned man, respected in the community, but Eric could see the battle raging inside him. Daniels wanted to support change, but he feared the backlash, both from within the department and from the public. "You're asking me to air our dirty laundry in front of the whole city," Daniels said one night, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Do you know what that will do to morale?" Eric leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the conference table. "Chief, morale isn't built on pretending everything is fine. It's built on trust, and trust is built on accountability. If we don't hold ourselves to the highest standard, why should the community believe in us?" The room fell into silence. Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. He knew Eric was right, but knowing it and acting on it were two different things. And Eric, patient but relentless, understood that leadership often required being the voice that others didn't want to hear but desperately needed. As word spread through the department that internal affairs was ramping up reviews, reactions varied. Some officers welcomed it, eager to see a culture of integrity strengthened. Others bristled, muttering about witch hunts and unfair scrutiny. Rumors swirled and whispers echoed in hallways. Eric was no stranger to being the unpopular man in the room, but this was different. This wasn't about one case. It was about a reckoning. One afternoon, during a departmental training session, Eric was invited to speak. He stood in front of a room full of officers, some curious, some hostile, many undecided. He didn't lecture them. He didn't accuse. Instead, he told them a story. "I was stopped on the side of the road 2 weeks ago." The room grew still, all eyes on him. What started as a routine traffic stop turned into something else. It wasn't about the light I may or may not have rolled through. It wasn't about safety. It was about assumption, about suspicion, about respect, or the lack of it. He let the words sink in before continuing. "I wasn't treated as a professional. I wasn't treated as a citizen who had earned the benefit of the doubt. I was treated as a threat because I didn't fit the picture in someone else's mind. That should matter to you, because every interaction you have out there defines not just you, but this entire department." The silence that followed was heavy but not empty. He could see the gears turning in some of their minds, the discomfort on others' faces. He didn't expect to win everyone over in a single speech, but he planted a seed of reflection, of accountability, of possibility. Outside of the department, the community began to notice the changes as well. Eric hosted forums where citizens could share their experiences with law enforcement, both good and bad. The turnout surprised even him. Churches, community centers, and school gyms filled with people eager to speak, to listen, and to be heard. Some shared stories of officers who had gone above and beyond, who had shown compassion in moments of crisis. Others shared stories of humiliation, fear, and mistrust. Eric listened to them all with the same calm focus he had on the side of that road. He took notes, asked questions, and assured them that their voices would not disappear into a void. "Change begins with listening, and I'm here to listen," he told them. Not everyone believed him. Some saw him as just another official making promises. Others doubted the system could ever change. But Eric didn't waver. Change wasn't about instant faith. It was about consistent action, and he was determined to show that this time would be different. Meanwhile, Larson's fate loomed in the background. An internal hearing was scheduled, one that Eric himself would oversee. The officer who had once swaggered toward Eric's car with smug confidence now found himself under the scrutiny of his peers and superiors. The hearing was tense, with Larson defensive at first, then visibly unraveling as the evidence stacked against him. Complaints, witness testimonies, and Eric's own first-hand account painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. When the suspension was announced, Larson's face turned pale, his career hanging in the balance. Some officers saw it as a warning. Others saw it as justice. For Eric, it was neither. It wasn't about punishing one man. It was about preventing the next incident. Weeks turned into months, and the work intensified. Eric spearheaded new training initiatives that focused not just on tactics, but on empathy, de-escalation, and cultural awareness. He brought in experts, psychologists, and community leaders to reshape how officers viewed their roles. He implemented systems of accountability that made it harder for misconduct to slip through the cracks. Every change was met with resistance, but also with resilience. Eric knew he was walking a tightrope. Pushed too hard, and he risked alienating the very people whose cooperation he needed. Pushed too little, and nothing would change. So he balanced firmness with patience, authority with compassion. He became both a critic and a coach, holding the department accountable while reminding them of the nobility of their calling. By the time fall arrived, something subtle but undeniable had shifted. Conversations in the hallways began to sound different. Officers started asking harder questions of themselves and each other. Complaints from the community began to decrease, not because problems disappeared overnight, but because interactions were improving. Small victories, an officer choosing to de-escalate rather than escalate, a citizen feeling respected during a stop, stacked up like bricks in the foundation of something new. Yet Eric knew the work was far from done. One changed policy didn't erase decades of mistrust. One suspension didn't fix a culture. Real change, he reminded himself daily, was a marathon, not a sprint. And as he looked out his office window at the city he served, he felt both the weight of the responsibility and the quiet strength of determination. For Eric Porter, the story wasn't about proving Larson wrong or making headlines. It was about something deeper, something larger than himself. It was about reimagining what justice could look like, not just in Sacramento, but in every community where fear and respect wrestled in the shadows of flashing blue and red lights.
Winter crept into Sacramento with a chill that seemed to sharpen every corner of the city. For Eric Porter, the season mirrored the moment, cold, heavy, and testing. Months of reviews, hearings, and reforms had stirred the department like a hornet's nest. Resistance had not disappeared, it had simply changed shape. Some officers avoided Eric in the hallways. Others stared with thinly veiled resentment, muttering about how he had turned the department upside down. But Eric had expected this. Change was never embraced warmly by everyone. It was dragged forward, inch by inch, against the pull of habit and pride. The community, however, was watching with fresh eyes. At town halls, citizens began speaking with a different tone. There was still anger, yes, and still frustration, but there was also a spark of something Eric hadn't heard in a long time. Hope. Stories trickled in. A young man stopped for a broken taillight who left the encounter not humiliated but respected. A mother who called 911 for help with her son's mental health crisis and found compassion instead of cuffs. a teenager who said that for the first time he didn't feel like prey when a police cruiser slowed near him. These stories weren't miracles, they were progress. Inside the department, Eric leaned heavily on allies. Officers who believed in his mission began to step forward more boldly. A sergeant named Ramirez, known for his calm presence in volatile situations, volunteered to help lead new training workshops. A young rookie, fresh out of the academy, pulled Eric aside one day and said, "I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference. What you're doing, it makes me believe I can." Those moments, rare but powerful, fueled Eric on the days when the pushback felt overwhelming. Then came the real test. A citywide review Eric had proposed months earlier was finally approved. It was the most ambitious undertaking the department had seen in years, a top-to-bottom audit of procedures, training, and officer conduct. The media caught wind of it, and suddenly Eric found himself the subject of headlines. Some praised him as a reformer willing to take on a broken system. Others criticized him as reckless, claiming he was destroying morale and undermining the force. Reporters hounded him, activists quoted him, and politicians debated his name in council chambers. Eric didn't let it rattle him. He stayed grounded in the same calm focus he'd shown during the traffic stop with Larson. When asked why he was doing this, he always gave the same answer: because trust isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything. Without it, we have nothing. The audit revealed truths that Eric already suspected, but now had the data to prove. Disparities in stops, patterns of profiling, lapses in accountability, all laid bare in black and white. Chief Daniels, reading the final report, sighed deeply. "You've just handed me a political powder keg," he said, sliding the thick binder across the table. Eric didn't flinch. "No, Chief. I've handed you an opportunity. The question is, do we light the fuse, or do we rebuild before it blows on its own?" The city council demanded answers. A public meeting was scheduled, and Eric was invited to present his findings. The night of the meeting, the chamber was packed. Citizens, officers, activists, journalists, all waiting to see how the department would respond. As Eric walked to the podium, he felt the weight of every eye in the room. He wasn't speaking as a bureaucrat with a title, he was speaking as a man who had lived the very problems he was trying to solve. His speech was measured but fierce. He didn't shy away from the failures. He named them, explained them, and traced their roots. But he also offered a vision: what policing could look like if accountability, empathy, and respect weren't afterthoughts but the core. "Justice," he said, his voice steady but resonant, "isn't measured by how many arrests we make or how many laws we enforce. It's measured by the trust of the people we serve. And right now, that trust is fragile. It's our job to rebuild it, not with promises, but with actions." The room erupted into mixed reactions. Applause from some, skepticism from others. Journalists scribbled furiously, officers shifted uncomfortably, but Eric didn't linger on the response. He had planted his flag. The rest would follow. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley Larson's story had not ended. His suspension weighed heavily, and rumors swirled about whether he would resign or face termination. But Eric had insisted on a process, not vengeance. Larson was given the chance to attend retraining and counseling. Whether he would embrace it or not was his choice. Eric believed in accountability, yes, but also in redemption. "People can change," he told Daniels when questioned, "but only if they're willing to face the truth of what they've done." Weeks later, Larson requested a private meeting with Eric. The man who walked into Eric's office was not the swaggering officer who had ordered him out of the car that night. His uniform hung a little looser, his posture was less certain, and his eyes carried something Eric hadn't seen before: humility. "I don't expect forgiveness," Larson said, his voice rough, "but I've had time to think, and I realize now I was wrong. Not just that night, in a lot of ways. I let the badge make me feel bigger than the people I was supposed to protect, and I don't want to be that man anymore." Eric studied him quietly, weighing the sincerity in his words. Change isn't about what you say in this office. It's about what you do every day when you put that badge back on. If you're serious, you'll have the chance to prove it. Larson nodded, his jaw tight. "Then I'll prove it." Eric didn't soften, but he allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. And sometimes, possibility was enough. As spring approached, the department began rolling out reforms based on the audit's findings. New training programs became mandatory, complaint review processes were overhauled, community advisory boards were formed to give citizens a direct voice. Progress was slow, messy, and imperfect, but it was happening. And with each step, Eric felt the tide shifting, just a little. The culmination came at a community event held in the heart of Sacramento. The auditorium was filled with officers, city leaders, and residents. Eric stood at the podium once again, but this time the air felt different. The tension that had once hung over the room was now tempered by a cautious optimism. He spoke not of failures, but of responsibility, not of blame, but of shared duty. The badge, he told them, holding his own up for everyone to see, is not a shield to hide behind. It is a promise that we will serve with integrity, with fairness, and with respect. Every person we meet is not just a suspect or a problem or a case number. They are people, and people deserve dignity. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but it was steady. It was real. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he scanned the crowd. He saw officers who had once doubted him now nodding quietly. He saw citizens who had once shouted in anger now listening intently. He even saw Larson sitting in the back, his expression unreadable, but his presence a sign that perhaps even the hardest hearts could bend. Walking out of the auditorium, Eric felt the night air cool against his skin. The work was far from over. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new resistance, new moments where progress seemed impossible. But tonight there was a sense of something rare, a beginning. Change, Eric knew, was not a finish line. It was a road, long and winding, walked one step at a time. And as he looked at the city lights stretching across the horizon, he felt the quiet certainty that those steps would continue. Because justice, in the end, was not about a single man, a single case, or even a single department. It was about the enduring belief that we can and must be better. And Eric Porter was ready to keep walking that road, no matter how long it took.